A millionaire offered $500 to a young homeless man to help him start over. Days later, he finds him at his brother's grave, who disappeared 20 years ago. Ethan Turner, a renowned millionaire and respected figure in New York's business world, walked briskly through the crowded streets of Manhattan. Though his thoughts were far from the bustling city around him, his footsteps echoed on the pavement, but his mind was lost in a painful memory that refused to let go. It had been 20 years since his younger brother, Daniel, had vanished without a trace. The unanswered questions surrounding Daniel's disappearance were a constant ache, a hollow space in his chest that all the money and success in the world could not fill. As he walked, something caught his eye: a young man huddled under the awning of a closed storefront. His clothes were worn and too thin to provide any real protection, his figure gaunt. His face was partially hidden behind long, unkempt hair, but Ethan could still see the exhaustion etched into the young man's features, the kind that goes deeper than sleepless nights, a weariness of the soul. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, unsure why he was even considering stopping. It wasn't like him to approach strangers, and he had long ago learned to close himself off from the plight of others. But there was something about the boy's eyes, empty, devoid of hope, that reached inside him, stirring a compassion he had not felt in a long time. He found himself moving toward the young man almost against his own will. "Are you all right?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking through the silence between them. He was startled by the genuine concern in his own tone. The young man looked up slowly, as if it took all the strength he had left to meet Ethan's gaze. His eyes were a pale, faded blue, bloodshot from what must have been countless sleepless nights. "I'm just trying to get by," he replied, his voice hoarse and barely audible, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Ethan wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't used to these kinds of encounters, where life stripped away all its pretense and left only the raw struggle to survive. Instinctively, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a $500 bill, holding it out to the young man. "Here," he said, his voice steady. "Use this to get yourself back on your feet. Everyone deserves a second chance." The young man's eyes widened in shock as he stared at the bill, then back at Ethan. This can't be real," he stammered, his voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "Why? Why would you do this for me?" Ethan shrugged, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. "Sometimes, a little bit of hope can make all the difference," he said softly, as if the words were meant as much for himself as they were for the young man. The boy hesitated before accepting the money, his fingers trembling as they closed around the bill. "My name's Alex," he offered, his voice still shaky, as if speaking it aloud made it feel more real. I'll make good use of this. I swear." Ethan nodded, but something about Alex's gaze lingered with him. There was a depth to it, an unspoken story that Ethan couldn't quite place. He felt the stirrings of a familiar unease, the kind that warned him when something was about to shift, when a moment would become a turning point. It was an impulse he had learned to trust over the years, though he didn't fully understand it. As he turned to walk away, he glanced back at Alex one last time, watching as the young man stared at the $500 in his hand, like it was the first sign of kindness he had encountered in a long time. It was then that Ethan felt a strange connection form between them, though he couldn't have guessed the role Alex would come to play in his life. But for now, Ethan simply walked on, not realizing that this brief encounter, this seemingly insignificant act of generosity, was the beginning of something far greater than either of them could imagine. The road ahead would be filled with unanswered questions, and the mystery of Daniel's disappearance would soon resurface, pulling Ethan and Alex into a tangled web of secrets, lies, and unexpected truths. A few days had passed since Ethan's unexpected encounter with Alex on the streets of Manhattan. Despite the city's unrelenting pace, the memory of the young man's hollow eyes lingered with him, an image that kept resurfacing at odd moments. So, when Ethan found himself at the cemetery where his brother Daniel was supposedly laid to rest, he was in no mood for further surprises. Yet, as he walked past the familiar rows of headstones, a figure caught his attention. Someone standing just a few feet away, staring at the graves with a distant, almost haunted expression. It was Alex. The sight of the young man here, of all places, sent a jolt through Ethan. His pulse quickened as questions surged to the forefront of his mind. What was Alex doing here? How could this be just a coincidence? "Alex," he called out, his voice louder than he intended. He approached cautiously, his steps slower, his gaze fixed on the young man's face, searching for some sign of recognition or explanation. Alex turned at the sound of his name, a look of surprise flashing in his eyes. For a brief moment, he seemed caught off guard, as though he hadn't expected to be seen or spoken to. But just as quickly, his expression softened into something more composed, as if he had carefully prepared himself for whatever might come next. "Mr. Turner," Alex replied, a hint of hesitation in his voice. "I didn't expect to see you here." His eyes flickered back to the rows of headstones, then back to Ethan, as if he were trying to read something in the older man's gaze. "I come here to think sometimes. It's one of the few places where I can find any peace." Ethan's brow furrowed. "To think?" he echoed, his voice carrying a trace of disbelief. It seemed an unusual place for a young man like Alex to frequent. Why here, of all places? Alex glanced away, his gaze settling on a nearby headstone, as if it provided him with some kind of unspoken comfort. "I guess," he began slowly, "I guess being here reminds me that there's more to life than just getting by." There was a raw honesty in his tone, an unguardedness that Ethan hadn't heard before. "What about you, Mr. Turner? Why are you here?" The question took Ethan by surprise, though it was only fair. He felt a sudden weight settle over him, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. He hadn't spoken about Daniel in so long, not to anyone who didn't already know the story. For a moment, he considered brushing off the question with some vague answer. But there was something about Alex's presence, the way he stood there with quiet patience, that compelled Ethan to speak the truth. "My brother is buried here," Ethan said, his voice low and strained. He forced himself to look past Alex, toward the headstone that bore Daniel's name. "He disappeared 20 years ago. We'd never found out what happened to him." Alex's gaze fell to the ground, his face tightening with a kind of empathy that seemed too deep for his years. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words carrying more weight than simple courtesy. "Losing someone without knowing why or how. I can't imagine what that must be like." Ethan felt a twinge of something. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just a sense that Alex understood him in a way that very few people did. It was as if the young man had tapped into a part of Ethan's pain that even he had struggled to articulate for all these years. Still, there was a shadow in Alex's expression, a darkness that Ethan couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't just pity. It was something else, something personal. "You speak as if you've experienced it yourself," Ethan said, studying Alex closely. "Have you?" For a moment, Alex didn't answer. His jaw tightened, and he seemed to wrestle with some unspoken thought. "Not exactly," he said finally, though the words sounded as though they had cost him something. "But I've lost people. Not in the same way, but they're gone and there are no explanations. Just questions that never seem to go away." Ethan's curiosity flared, but he held back, sensing that pushing Alex too hard might make him retreat. Instead, He shifted his gaze back to Daniel's headstone. "I come here whenever I can," he admitted. "I guess I keep hoping that somehow I might find some kind of answer." Alex nodded slowly, his eyes drifting back to the graves around them. "Do you ever feel like you're searching for something you're never going to find?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. There was a vulnerability in his tone that Ethan hadn't expected, a glimpse into the young man's own struggles. Ethan didn't respond right away. The question lingered in the air between them, resonating in a way that struck deep. "Every day," he said at last, his voice barely audible. "But I have to keep looking, because if I don't, then I don't know who I am anymore." There was a long silence as the two men stood there, bound together by an unspoken understanding. Ethan found himself searching Alex's face, wondering what it was about this young man that had brought him into his life so unexpectedly. And why did it feel like there was more to this chance encounter than either of them realized? But before he could pursue the thought any further, Alex glanced at his watch and shifted uneasily. "I should go," he said, though there was a reluctance in his voice, as if part of him didn't want to leave. "It was good to see you, Mr. Turner, and I hope you find the answers you're looking for." Ethan watched as Alex turned and walked away, a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside him. Curiosity, concern, and something else he couldn't quite name. He wasn't sure why, but he had a feeling that this wouldn't be the last time their paths crossed. As he looked back at Daniel's headstone, a thought crept into his mind. Perhaps Alex was a part of the answers he sought. And if that were true, then the young man's reappearance in his life was more than just a coincidence. It was a sign. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their stories were somehow connected, that Alex held a piece of the puzzle to the mystery that had haunted him for 2 decades. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. The chance encounter at the cemetery lingered in Ethan's mind, gnawing at his thoughts like an unsolved riddle. It wasn't the first time his instincts had urged him to dig deeper, to follow a feeling that something wasn't quite right. He had spent a lifetime learning to trust those instincts, and now they pointed directly at Alex. It was more than just coincidence. The young man's presence at Daniel's grave felt like a piece of a much larger puzzle, one that Ethan was now determined to solve. Ethan contacted Lisa Moretti, a private investigator he had known for years and trusted with his most delicate matters. She was thorough, relentless, and had a knack for uncovering secrets others would rather keep buried. "So, what exactly are you hoping to find?" Lisa asked as she flipped through the initial background information she'd gathered. They were seated in Ethan's study, where files and documents lay scattered across the mahogany desk. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at a photograph of Alex that Lisa had taken from a surveillance camera near the cemetery. "There's something about him," he said, his voice thoughtful but firm. He knew things, the way he spoke about loss. It was like he understood my pain in a way few could. "I need to know why." Lisa sighed, tapping a pen against the file. "You're aware he's just a homeless kid, right? It could easily be a coincidence. People wander into cemeteries for all kinds of reasons. And even if he does have a troubled past, what makes you think it's connected to?" She didn't finish the sentence. There was no need to mention Daniel's name. "There are too many coincidences," Ethan replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "It's not just his being at the cemetery. It's his eyes, the way he spoke about loss, the hesitation in his voice when he talked about finding peace. It felt personal." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I need you to dig. Find out everything there is to know about Alex." Lisa gave a reluctant nod, but her curiosity was piqued. "All right, I'll see what I can find," she said. "But don't get your hopes up." Days passed, and as the investigation unfolded, Lisa uncovered more details about Alex's life than Ethan had anticipated. She pieced together fragments from scattered records, foster care files, police reports of minor incidents, and an incomplete trail of addresses that marked the young man's transit existence. But then, a discovery brought the pieces into sharper focus. When she came to Ethan with her findings, her expression was grave. "There's something you need to know," she began, placing a stack of papers in front of him. "Alex isn't just some kid with a rough past. He's James McAllister's nephew." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. James McAllister, the ruthless corporate magnate who had been his fiercest rival for decades. Their enmity was legendary, marked by vicious legal battles, boardroom confrontations, and more than one dirty tactic on James's part. But what chilled Ethan the most was the realization that James's reach now extended into his personal life, casting a shadow over even the most sacred of places, his brother's grave. "McAllister's nephew?" Ethan repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. He ran a hand through his hair, processing the implications. How could Alex end up on the streets if he's related to someone like James? Lisa shook her head. "It's not clear yet. The records show that Alex had a difficult childhood, bounced between foster homes after his parents died when he was young. There's no evidence that James ever took him in or even acknowledged him. It's possible that they've had little to no contact." Ethan's eyes darkened with suspicion. "Or James wanted it that way," he said. "He's a man who ties up loose ends. If Alex had somehow become inconvenient, it would be like James to make sure he disappeared." Lisa folded her arms, her brow furrowing. "If that's true, then Alex could be in more danger than he realizes." "But Ethan, what are you planning to do with this information?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He was still absorbing the shock of the revelation, still grappling with the possibility that this young man could be a pawn, or perhaps even a casualty, in his long-standing feud with McAllister. But there was something about Alex's eyes that kept coming back to him. They were eyes that had seen more than they should have, eyes that carried secrets. "I need to talk to him," Ethan said finally, a note of resolve in his voice. "There's more to his story, and I need to hear it from him. I have a feeling that whatever's happened to Alex is connected to my brother. It's the only thing that makes sense." Lisa's skepticism didn't fade entirely, but she nodded in agreement. "Just be careful. If McAllister's involved, then whatever this is, it goes deep. We need to tread lightly." Ethan's gaze drifted back to the photograph of Alex. There was no turning back now. The threads were too tightly interwoven. He would find Alex and get to the bottom of whatever secrets lay buried between the boy and his uncle. And if, by some cruel twist of fate, James McAllister was behind Daniel's disappearance, then Ethan would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. Little did he know, the path ahead would lead him deeper into a labyrinth of deceit than he had ever imagined. Armed with the revelation about Alex's connection to James McAllister, Ethan's resolve only hardened. He needed answers, and he was determined to get them from Alex himself. There was no room for ambiguity now. Ethan returned to the same spot where he had first spoken with the young man, a place that now felt like a staging ground for a confrontation that had been a long time coming. He saw Alex lingering near the storefront, the same air of weariness about him. As Ethan approached, Alex seemed to sense his presence and turned, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to unease the moment he saw the look in Ethan's eyes. "Alex," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm, "we need to talk." Alex's shoulders tensed. "What is it, Mr. Turner?" he asked, but the tone of his voice suggested he already had some idea of what was coming. Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. "Are you James McAllister's nephew?" The question hung in the air, carrying with it the weight of a history that Alex had tried to leave behind. His face went pale, and his body stiffened as if bracing for a blow. Yes, he admitted reluctantly, his voice barely above a whisper. But I haven't had any contact with him for years. I left that part of my life behind a long time ago. Ethan took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. Why? He pressed. What happened between you and your uncles? There was a flicker of something in Alex's expression. Fear, anger, maybe even shame. It's complicated, he replied, his voice shaking slightly. James, he's not just ruthless in business. He's a dangerous man in every way that matters. When I was younger, I thought I could live with that, thought I could ignore the things I saw. But Alex's voice faltered, his gaze dropping to the ground as if the memories were too heavy to meet Ethan's stare. But Ethan prompted, a cold sensation creeping down his spine. He sensed that Alex was holding back something significant, something that might finally shed light on the darkness surrounding his own past. But the older I got, the more I understood what I was really seeing. The people who worked for James weren't just businessmen or security. They were enforcers, some of them even ex-criminals, Alex said, his tone tinged with bitterness. He had a way of making people disappear, and not just in the corporate sense. There were whispers, rumors of debts paid with more than just money. It got to the point where I couldn't look at him without seeing all the things he kept hidden. Ethan's stomach tightened, dread pooling in his chest. Did any of those things involve my brother? The question was direct, his voice taut with a mixture of hope and fear. Alex met Ethan's gaze, but there was a hesitation in his eyes. I don't know, he said, shaking his head slowly. But there were times when he'd talk about taking care of old problems. He'd never say anything outright, never give details. But there was always a look in his eyes, like he enjoyed the power it gave him to know he could make someone vanish if he wanted to. Ethan's pulse quickened. And you never questioned it? He asked, frustration seeping into his voice. You just turned a blind eye to all of it. I was a kid, Ethan. Alex shot back, his voice breaking with the weight of suppressed guilt. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified of him. He wasn't just an uncle. He was like a shadow that hung over my life, reminding me every day that I owed everything to him. The money, the education, the so-called opportunities, they all came with strings. And when I finally realized how tight those strings were, I cut them. Ethan regarded Alex with a mixture of pity and suspicion. The story explained a lot, but it didn't answer the most pressing question. So why are you living on the streets, he asked. If you walked away from McAllister's wealth and influence, why end up here? Alex took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as if trying to focus on a thought that was almost out of reach. Because it wasn't just about walking away, he said quietly. It was about hiding. I didn't leave my uncle's world. I escaped from it. I've been running ever since. He hesitated before continuing, his voice dropping to a near whisper. There were incidents, times when I knew too much or got too close to something James wanted kept secret. I think he wanted me out of the picture. Permanently. Ethan's jaw clenched. You think your own uncle tried to have you killed? I don't think, Ethan, Alex replied, his voice hardening. I know. There were 2 attempts that I'm sure of. I don't know if he ordered them directly or if it was one of his people. But the message was clear. His eyes grew distant as he spoke, as though replaying the memories in his mind. The first time, I was nearly pushed off a construction site. The second, let's just say it involved a car that suddenly stopped having brakes. Ethan's blood ran cold as he listened, his instincts screaming that there was more to this story than Alex was saying. And you believe he's still looking for you? Alex nodded slowly. I can't say for certain, but I never stay in one place for long. It's the only way to stay safe. Ethan's thoughts raced, connecting fragments of information he had gathered over the years. If Alex had been a target, then James wasn't above turning on his own blood to keep his secrets buried. But what could Alex know that was worth that kind of risk? And was it possible that something about Daniel's disappearance was linked to all of this? Ethan's voice softened, though it held a hint of desperation. Alex, if there's any chance that my brother's fate is tied to your uncle's, I need to know. Whatever it takes. Alex swallowed, his expression conflicted. I wish I could give you a clear answer, he said. But I don't know what happened to Daniel. I wasn't even aware of his disappearance until now. But I do know that James has connections in places you wouldn't expect. Powerful people, dangerous people. He's made a lot of deals to keep his hands clean while others did the dirty work. Ethan's grip tightened on the edge of the table beside him. Then help me expose him, he said. If you have any information, anything at all that could lead back to him, we could bring him down together. Alex hesitated, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. I don't have proof, he said, his voice shaking slightly. But I might know where we could find some. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Where? Alex took a breath, his voice steadying as he answered. There's an old warehouse in the Brooklyn docks. It used to be a front for one of his shell companies. I don't know if anything's still there, but it's a place to start. Ethan's mind raced with possibilities. If there was any chance that evidence linking James to criminal activities, or even Daniel's disappearance, could be found, then it was worth the risk. He glanced at Alex, who looked as though he was ready to bolt at any moment. Then that's where we go next, Ethan said, his voice resolute. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this lead would only take them deeper into the darkness. Ethan and Lisa made their way to the abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn, following Alex's lead. The place had a haunted air, with its crumbling facade and shattered windows that hinted at a past full of secrets. The warehouse was surrounded by barbed wire and rusted metal, and the silence inside was punctuated only by the echoes of their footsteps as they ventured deeper into the labyrinth of empty rooms and darkened hallways. This place looks like it hasn't been used in years, Lisa murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, as if afraid to disturb whatever might be lurking in the shadows. Ethan scanned the area, his eyes darting between the rows of dusty crates and old machinery. If James ever did business here, there's got to be something left behind, he replied, a determined edge to his voice. We just need to find it. They moved cautiously, methodically searching each room, opening boxes, and checking drawers for any trace of documents or clues that might still remain. It wasn't until they reached the back of the warehouse that Lisa noticed a door, almost hidden behind a stack of rusted metal shelves. The lock on it had been recently replaced, a sign that someone had been here more recently than the warehouse's dilapidated state suggested. Over here, Lisa called to Ethan, nodding toward the door. This lock isn't as old as the rest of this place. Ethan joined her, his jaw tightening as he inspected the door. Let's see what's inside. He gave the lock a hard twist, breaking it open with a crowbar Lisa had found nearby. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a small, windowless room. Inside, the air was thick with dust, but it was clear that this room had been used for more than just storage. There was a large metal filing cabinet against the far wall, and a small wooden desk littered with papers. Lisa immediately began sifting through the contents of the cabinet, while Ethan rummaged through the stacks of folders on the desk. Check this out, Lisa said, her voice steady but her expression intense. She pulled out a manila folder marked with the initials JM. Inside were documents outlining a network of offshore accounts, records of transactions that span back decades, and names of art dealers who had long been suspected of dealing in stolen artifacts. As Ethan skimmed through the pages, his eyes landed on a document that stood out, a ledger listing various acquisitions. Next to some of the entries, he noticed the term Operation D. He froze. "Lisa, take a look at this," he said, handing her the paper. Lisa's brow furrowed as she read it. Operation D, dated exactly 20 years ago, the same year Daniel disappeared, she said, glancing up at Ethan. "Coincidence?" Ethan asked, though the skepticism in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "Not a chance," Lisa replied, setting the document down and reaching back into the cabinet. She pulled out a thick binder labeled with the same Operation D insignia. Opening it, she found pages filled with what appeared to be coded messages and surveillance reports. There were lists of dates and locations, some of which corresponded to places Ethan recognized from Daniel's life before he vanished. "Ethan, I think we've found something significant," Lisa said, her voice tense with the weight of the discovery. "This isn't just about stolen art. These reports detail surveillance on several individuals. And look," she added, pointing to a section marked with a date and a location, one that corresponded with the last known sighting of Daniel. It says, "Target relocated. Situation neutralized." Ethan's heart pounded as he processed the implications. Target. That's how they referred to him, he muttered, a wave of anger and grief washing over him. If Daniel was part of this operation, then James knew exactly what happened to him. As they continued combing through the documents, they found correspondence between James and a few of his associates. The letters were cryptic but suggested payments for services rendered, and they referenced individuals who had fulfilled their roles. One letter, dated a few months before Daniel's disappearance, mentioned a final phase of Operation D and included a handwritten note from James. "Loose ends must be handled with discretion. That bastard," Ethan spat, slamming his fist against the desk. "He orchestrated this whole thing, and he made sure Daniel would never come back." Lisa's gaze sharpened. "These documents could be enough to reopen the investigation," she said, her tone urgent. "If we can connect these coded messages and offshore accounts to something concrete, we could have enough to bring James to justice." Ethan nodded, but his thoughts were already moving faster. It wasn't just about legal justice. It was about finding out exactly what had happened to his brother and why. He needed more than just these pieces of paper. He needed to confront James himself. He needed answers that only his old rival could give. But before that could happen, they would have to make sense of the complex web James had spun over the years. There were still too many unanswered questions. What role did Daniel play in this operation, and why had he been targeted? Did Alex know more than he was letting on, or was he just another pawn caught in James's schemes? Ethan looked at Lisa, who was already packing up the documents they'd found. "We're going to need more than just these papers," he said, his voice resolute. "We need to find people who were involved, people who can testify to what James has been doing." Lisa nodded. "I'll start cross-referencing these names with known associates of James and see if anyone's been arrested or gone off the grid recently. There's bound to be someone who slipped up." Ethan's expression hardened as he thought about James, about the decades of rivalry and the unspeakable pain he'd endured because of him. If these documents were even half as incriminating as they appeared, then James was about to face the consequences for everything he had done, and Ethan was going to make sure of it. But even as they left the warehouse with the evidence in hand, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the deeper they dug, the darker the secrets would become. This was only the beginning of a much larger fight. Ethan walked into the grand ballroom of the luxurious Manhattan hotel with a singular purpose. The gala was a who's who of New York's elite, with titans of industry and socialites mingling under the glittering chandeliers. It was a setting James McAllister thrived in, a place where he could bask in his power and influence. But tonight, Ethan was not here to exchange pleasantries or uphold appearances. He was here for answers. He spotted James near the center of the room, holding court among a circle of admirers, a glass of champagne in his hand. James's laughter echoed across the ballroom, carrying with it a smugness that made Ethan's blood boil. For a moment, Ethan just stood there watching, his anger simmering as he took in a man who had haunted his life for decades. It was time. Ethan crossed the room with measured steps, his gaze never leaving James's face. The moment their eyes met, a flicker of recognition passed between them, followed by an unmistakable tension that spread through the surrounding guests. Conversations died down as the air grew thick with unspoken animosity. McAllister, Ethan began, his voice steady but laced with barely restrained fury. "We need to talk." James's smile barely faltered as he dismissed the others with a casual wave. "Ethan," he greeted, a cold amusement in his eyes. "It's been a while. I wasn't expecting you to make an appearance tonight." His tone was as smooth as silk, but there was a sharpness beneath it, a readiness for confrontation. Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. "Cut the act," he snapped, his voice lowering but carrying a dangerous edge. "You know damn well why I'm here. You know exactly what happened to Daniel, don't you?" James's smile faded slightly and his eyes hardened. "What makes you so sure?" he replied, a slight sneer curling his lips. "You've been chasing ghosts for 20 years, Turner. It's time to let the past die." "The past doesn't die," Ethan shot back, taking a step closer, his voice a low growl. "Not when there are still questions that need answers. I found the warehouse, James. I know about Operation D." He saw the brief flicker in James's eyes, a flash of recognition that confirmed his suspicions. "You were behind it, weren't you? Daniel was just another loose end for you to take care of." James's expression didn't change, but there was a sudden stillness in his posture, a quiet acknowledgement that Ethan's words had hit their mark. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Turner," he said, his voice lowering. "Some truths are better left buried." Ethan's anger surged, his composure cracking under the weight of 2 decades of grief and frustration. "You don't get to decide that," he said, his voice rising. "You don't get to play God with people's lives and then act like it's nothing. Daniel was my brother. You took him from me, and I'm not going to rest until I know why." James let out a dry chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic," he remarked, his tone dripping with condescension. "But let's get one thing straight. Daniel made his own choices. I may have given him a push in the right direction, but he was already halfway down the road to ruin." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. "What did you do to him, James?" he demanded, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Stop talking in circles and tell me the truth." James took a sip of his champagne, as if considering Ethan's demand. "Very well," he said, setting the glass down with a deliberate motion. "If you want the truth, then here it is. Your brother was involved in things far beyond your understanding. Things he never could have shared with you. He made certain unfortunate decisions, and when it became clear that he was going to jeopardize everything, I did what needed to be done. There it was." The confession Ethan had dreaded and needed in equal measure. "You had him killed," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though saying it out loud made it real. James's gaze was steady, unflinching. "I didn't pull the trigger," he replied coldly, "but I made sure he wasn't a threat. If you want to call that murder, so be it. I call it damage control." Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine as he looked into James's eyes and saw no hint of remorse, only a ruthless pragmatism that had driven every decision the man had ever made. "You'll pay for this," Ethan said, his voice filled with a deadly calm. "I have evidence, the documents, the records from the warehouse." James cut him off, his expression shifting into one of detached boredom. "You think those scraps of paper will be enough?" he scoffed. "Go ahead and try, Turner. You're not the first person who's tried to bring me down, and you won't be the last. But I've always had a way of handling my problems." Ethan took a step back, his gaze burning with a renewed determination. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice firm. "This isn't over." As Ethan turned to leave, James's voice followed him, low and taunting. "You've always been good at starting fights, Turner. Let's see if you're any good at finishing them." Ethan didn't look back. He didn't need to. The confrontation had only confirmed what he already knew. James McAllister was behind Daniel's disappearance, and he was willing to do whatever it took to keep the truth buried. But now, with a confession in hand, however indirect, and the evidence from the warehouse, Ethan had the ammunition he needed to take the fight to the next level. The time for subtlety was over. Ethan would expose James for what he was, no matter the cost. He owed it to Daniel, to himself, and to every other person whose life James had destroyed in his ruthless pursuit of power. The real battle was just beginning. With the evidence gathered from the warehouse and James's own veiled confession at the gala, Ethan and Lisa worked tirelessly to build a case solid enough to bring James McAllister to trial. The documents, financial records, and coded messages they had uncovered painted a damning picture of corruption, money laundering, and illicit deals. But it was the personal accounts that would deliver the most devastating blows. When Alex agreed to testify, it was a turning point. His testimony would expose the darker side of his uncle's operations, the secrets James had kept so well hidden for decades. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial, buzzing with anticipation and morbid curiosity. This was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a public spectacle, the fall of a powerful man who had operated above the law for so long. Ethan sat behind the prosecution, his eyes fixed on James, who remained impassive in the defendant's chair. The look on his face was one of controlled disdain, as if the entire trial were a tedious inconvenience rather than a fight for his freedom. Ethan's thoughts drifted to Daniel, the brother who had vanished so many years ago. Every moment in that courtroom was a reminder of the pain that had never truly left him. But there was also hope. Hope that finally James would be held accountable. Alex took the stand on the third day of the trial. The young man's hands trembled slightly as he was sworn in, but there was a steely resolve in his eyes. As he began to recount his experiences with his uncle, the courtroom fell silent, the tension palpable. He spoke of the secret meetings, the offshore accounts, and the people who disappeared after crossing James's path. It was a side of the powerful magnate that few had ever seen, and as Alex peeled back the layers, the jury seemed to sit up straighter, absorbing every word. "My uncle always operated in the shadows," Alex said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "He had people who took care of things for him. Problems, as he called them. If someone got in his way or knew too much, they were dealt with. It didn't matter who they were. Family was no exception." The prosecutor approached, her expression grave. "Alex, can you tell the court about Operation D?" Alex hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "Operation D," Alex continued, "was a cleanup. That's how it was described in the documents I found. It was a way to take care of issues discreetly. And around that time," he took a breath. "Around that time, my uncle mentioned someone who had become a liability. I didn't know it then, but now I'm certain he was talking about Daniel Turner. A murmur swept through the courtroom, and the judge banged her gavel. Order in the court. Ethan's jaw clenched as he listened to Alex's testimony, the painful truth seeping in deeper with each word. There it was, spoken aloud for the first time in a public setting. His brother hadn't just disappeared. He had been erased. The defense attorney tried to discredit Alex, painting him as a troubled young man with a vendetta against his uncle. "Isn't it true, Alex," the attorney began, "that you've had a history of drug abuse and have been estranged from your family for years?" Alex's face tightened, but he didn't back down. "Yes, it's true. I went through some dark times. But that doesn't change the fact that I saw things and I heard things. And it doesn't change what my uncle is capable of." The prosecutor stepped in to redirect. "Your past struggles don't discredit your testimony. In fact, they make it even more remarkable that you're here today, willing to expose the truth, despite everything you've been through." She turned back to the jury. "This case isn't about Alex's mistakes. It's about the choices James McAllister made and the people who suffered because of them." As the days passed, more evidence was presented, and the pattern of criminal activity became clearer. Witnesses corroborated Alex's claims, and the documents Lisa and Ethan had found were used to illustrate the intricate web of deceit James had spun. But the moment that stayed with Ethan the most was when a former employee of McAllister's, a man named Gerald, took the stand. Gerald was a weary-looking middle-aged man, a former fixer for the McAllister empire who had recently come forward, perhaps out of guilt or fear for his own conscience. "Mr. McAllister always had people like me to do the dirty work," Gerald confessed, his voice rough with regret. "There were payments made to silence individuals, threats against those who wouldn't stay quiet. And when it came to the Turners, well, I was told to make sure no one asked any more questions about Daniel." "What exactly were your instructions?" the prosecutor asked. Gerald hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously toward James. "To ensure that Daniel Turner disappeared permanently." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his stomach as the weight of Gerald's words sank in. This was the confirmation he had feared yet needed. There was no longer any doubt. James had orchestrated Daniel's disappearance with calculated precision, and now, at last, the world knew. The trial concluded with closing arguments that were as impassioned as they were damning. The prosecution painted James as a man who wielded power like a weapon, who believed himself untouchable. The defense tried to cast doubt, arguing that there was no direct evidence linking James to Daniel's death, only circumstantial connections and the word of compromised witnesses. But as the jury deliberated, Ethan could sense the shift in the room. The tide had turned. When the verdict was read, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. "We find the defendant, James McAllister, guilty on all counts." The judge's sentencing was swift and unforgiving. "Mr. McAllister, you are hereby sentenced to a minimum of 30 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole," she declared. "Your actions have caused irreparable harm, and you will face the consequences." For the first time in years, Ethan felt a glimmer of relief. It was fleeting, and it didn't bring Daniel back, but it was something, an acknowledgement that justice, however belated, had been served. As James was led away in handcuffs, the former titan of industry, now reduced to a disgraced criminal, Ethan allowed himself a small breath. Yet, as the courtroom began to empty, the familiar ache returned, reminding him that this victory, while significant, could never fill the void left by his brother's absence. As Ethan stepped outside, he saw Alex waiting. The young man's face was a mixture of relief and sorrow, as if he too was struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. "It's over," Alex said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured. Ethan nodded. "For now," he replied. He glanced back at the courthouse, feeling the cold reality of what still lay ahead. James might be behind bars, but the scars from the past remained, and there was still much healing to be done. The legal battle had ended, but the emotional one was far from over. After the trial, when the dust began to settle, Ethan found himself standing outside the courthouse, staring at the place where his life had just shifted in ways he was still struggling to understand. The pain was still there, the loss of Daniel a wound that had not yet healed, but there was also a sense of resolution, however small, that had eluded him for so long. As he lingered in thought, Alex approached him, his expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "Mr. Turner," Alex began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. If it wasn't for your kindness that day, when you reached out to me on the street, I never would have found the courage to face my past. I wouldn't have found a reason to keep fighting." Ethan turned to face him, and for the first time in years, a genuine smile touched his lips. There was a light in his eyes, not just from relief or triumph, but something deeper, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. "You give me too much credit, Alex," he said quietly. "Helping you, it gave me a way to make peace with my own past. We both needed to find something to hold on to, and in a strange way, we ended up helping each other. We've both found our own kind of redemption." Alex nodded, his eyes glistening as he struggled to find the right words. "I'm not sure where to start," he admitted. "There's a lot I need to make up for, a lot of time I lost running from who I was. But I want to do something real with my life now. I want to make a difference." Ethan's smile grew warmer, a quiet pride settling in his chest. "You've already taken the hardest step," he said. "The rest is just moving forward. Use what you've been through to help others. There's power in your story, Alex. You can give people hope, people who felt like they had no way out." Taking Ethan's words to heart, Alex began volunteering at an organization dedicated to helping the homeless rebuild their lives. It was a place where his experiences mattered, where he could speak to others who had walked the same dark paths and show them that it was possible to come back from it. He spent his days working in the shelters, organizing outreach events, and even speaking at meetings to share his journey. He told his story honestly, about the pain, the mistakes, the fear that had gripped him for so long. And in doing so, he found that each telling loosened the hold his past had on him. The transformation wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. There were setbacks, moments when the weight of everything he had been through seemed too much to bear. But with each person he helped, each life he touched, he felt a little more of the darkness lift. He began to see himself not as a victim of his uncle's cruelty, but as someone who had found strength in surviving it. One evening, several months later, Alex received a call from Ethan. "How are things at the shelter?" Ethan asked, his tone warm and familiar. "Busy?" Alex replied, the sound of bustling activity in the background. "But it's a good kind of busy. We're organizing a fundraiser next week. I'm giving a speech about what it means to get a second chance." Ethan's voice softened. "You deserve it, Alex. I'm proud of what you're doing. Your story, it's making a difference." There was a brief silence on the line, a moment of unspoken understanding between them. "I wanted to tell you something," Alex said finally. "Working here, seeing people find hope again, it's made me realize that I don't just want to survive anymore. I want to live. And that's something I never thought I'd say." Ethan's heart swelled with a mixture of joy and sadness. He thought of Daniel, of the life his brother never got the chance to live, and he knew that this was a way of honoring his memory by helping someone else find the light in the darkness. "I think Daniel would have liked you," Ethan said softly. "You would have understood each other." There was a pause, and when Alex spoke again, his voice was quiet. "I hope, in some way, I'm doing right by him too." Ethan hung up the phone with a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He wasn't naive enough to believe that all the pain would just vanish, but there was a lightness in his steps that hadn't been there before. He knew he would continue to use his fortune to help others, just as he had helped Alex. It wasn't about atoning for the past, but about embracing the chance to do something meaningful with the time he had left. He funded more programs for at-risk youth, supported shelters, and invested in outreach initiatives that provided second chances to those who needed them most. Each project felt like a step toward healing, a way to turn the darkness that had defined his life into something that could bring hope to others. Ethan and Alex continued to see each other regularly. They weren't family in the traditional sense, but there was a bond between them that felt just as strong. Perhaps even stronger because it was forged in the crucible of shared struggle and redemption. They would meet for coffee and talk about the latest developments at the shelter or discuss the progress of the people Alex was working with. And sometimes they would talk about Daniel, about the memories Ethan had shared and the legacy that now lived on in the actions they took. The unexpected connection between them had grown into something indestructible, a friendship that transcended the pain and loss that had initially brought them together. Their shared journey was more than a search for justice. It was a quest for healing, for redemption. It was about taking back control of their lives from the shadows that had once loomed so large and learning to let hope define their futures. In the end, they found that even the most broken stories could be rewritten if you were willing to fight for a different ending. And they did. Together, they fought for each new day, not as victims of their past, but as survivors who had discovered the power of resilience and the profound strength in choosing to live again. If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.